In your place, I would be having a sign that said, here's what's going on. In your place, I would be just exhibit. Absolutely.
What do you want?
I agree, and I even have talked to her about it, and I found a way to spin that in a positive way. Basically, I'm saying it's something that's good for you, it's something to bring forward, so we shouldn't have any problem with it, but I was doing it.
I can help pick it up.
I like the joke.
Hello, welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm just thrilled that you all are here considering everything else going on this morning in Washington. Never knew 2 months ago when we scheduled this but that's life in DC. So I'm Michelle Nellenbach. I'm the director of the infrastructure project here at the BPC. And we have been involved in the natural disaster resiliency space for a little while now, largely stemming from a recommendation our Executive Council on Infrastructure put out that we need to better account for life cycle costs of an asset. And so we think if we were to do that up front, you would naturally have to incorporate the cost of natural disasters when you design and build a project, leading to more resilient materials, better development decisions, that type of thing. And so we have been pushing that for quite some time here in DC. And this event is focused on folks who've been on the ground in disasters and who can speak a little bit about what they've seen, and some of the experts who've done a lot of research in this space who can talk about resiliency and how it can reduce costs. Because fundamentally, while we know these disasters are going to come and that they're getting worse, our federal government does not seem well prepared to deal with those costs. And that has been another mission of the BPC, to get those costs appropriately taken care of up front and paid for, so they don't become a political football like we're starting to see happen lately. So with that, we've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker, who is Madhu Beriwal. She's the founder, president, and CEO of IEM. She has over 3 decades of experience in disaster and emergency management, homeland security, national defense, and the use of information technology to resolve complex protection issues. She founded IEM in 1985 as a company dedicated to developing solutions for the most complex challenges in emergency management and homeland security and defense. And this is exciting, it is the largest women-owned company in the homeland security and emergency management space. IEM's customers include federal agencies like Department of Homeland Security, DOD, state and local management organizations in all 50 states, District of Columbia, critical infrastructure including nuclear power plants, chemical plants, hospitals, mass transit. You get the picture. They have been involved in projects in the Middle East, India, Russia, Turkey, the Ukraine, Korea, Taiwan, Haiti, and Kuwait. So please join me in welcoming Madhu Bariwal to the stage.
Thank you, Michelle. I wanted to start by talking about where I came from, what I bring to the discussion on resiliency and disaster management. So I started my career in 1980 as a floodplain manager for the state of Louisiana. As you know, Louisiana has a little bit of a flooding problem here and there. And I learned firsthand the difficulty of getting communities to sign up for better building codes, for being part of the flood insurance program, for doing floodplain management in a non-structural fashion, really trying to protect their communities before the disaster happened. And in 1983, there was a major flood in Louisiana, in the Alexandria area, and I got to actually work as a disaster worker out in working with the homeowners that came in. And the system that we had for disaster recovery was so awful that I thought, surely we can do better than this in how we deal with disasters in this country. After that, I had a opportunity to work as a program manager for Southeast Louisiana Hurricane Study, which looked at how to use technology, models and simulations and data to be able to see what the threat would be of a catastrophic hurricane striking New Orleans and what we would do about it. And that really opened my eyes to the use of information technology, use of data, use of science, and use of technological tools to do better in all phases of disaster. And that's when I formed the company in 1985 to push forward the use of science and technology and data and produce better outcomes for people that are in the middle of a disaster, after a disaster, before a disaster, and of course, between disasters. But fast forwarding from there to now, starting really with 2005 with Hurricane Katrina and Rita, and then certainly in the last several years since 2016, we've seen a string of disasters. And what is very evident is that the way we are using science and technology is failing us. Because we have the flood insurance maps. They tell you where, 1% probability of flooding in this area. But if you look back at the disasters that have occurred in 2016, 17, 18, and now in 19, the vast preponderance of people that have flooded did not have flood insurance because they were not in the 100-year floodplain. And so they did not feel that they were at risk. The risk in those flood maps does not accurately reflect what the actual risks are today. And we don't know what will happen in the next 10, 20 years as we see the changes that are occurring in our climate and the preponderance of hurricanes and storms and rainfall events that we haven't foreseen. For the last big storms that we had, Hurricane Harvey, for example, the 2016 Louisiana Great Flood, those are considered to be 500 or 1,000-year events. But we are having them at increasing frequency, not even in the 10-year span, but in 2 and 3 year spans, we're seeing the same disasters over and over again. So the theme of this talk there we go. Okay, so the theme of this talk is really how do we reduce the costs of natural disasters and how do we build better and stronger as we go forward. So what I really want to say is the overlying theme of my talks today is the past is no longer a prologue for the future. We cannot rely on the hundreds of years of data on which the flood insurance maps are built and say this is the risk and this is what we need to mitigate. We don't know anymore what the risks are, and we really need to do a much better job of using forecasting technologies, modeling and simulation and data to be able to figure out where in the future, what the risks are for the future. Because when we build infrastructure, whether it's a wastewater plant or housing, or we do something for economic development, those structures need to last for the next 100 and 200 years. So we have to forecast the threat that's there and know what we are designing against. We have the capability to forecast excuse me, I'm trying to mix. Okay. While she's checking on making the slides work, we'll carry on. I'm talking about technology not working as well for us anymore, so here's an example of it. We knew how to forecast well in the old days. So when you look at the technologies that, for example, I used in 1983 and 84 on the hurricane evacuation study for New Orleans, we had the storm surge models, we had the wind models, we had the ability to figure out how long evacuation would take. And even fast forwarding it to 2004 and 2005, before Hurricane Katrina, we actually did a simulation for FEMA, for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that looked at what would happen if a catastrophic hurricane struck New Orleans, and how would we deal with the aftermath of that disaster. So we created a hypothetical hurricane called Hurricane Pam. Nothing to do with Pam Patino, who's going to be talking about things in moderating the next panel. But interestingly, it was the wife's name of Colonel Mike Brown, not the Mike Brown from FEMA, another Mike Brown. Life can be very strange sometimes, who was the director of emergency management for the state of Louisiana. So we created this hypothetical hurricane, and we predicted the consequences and used those consequences to drive what recovery would require. And the initial phases of recovery, not long-term recovery, but short-term recovery would require. And that particular project was the first time that the federal government had put aside money for catastrophic planning in the United States as a formal activity, 2004. And so that effort was still going on when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. And this is a comparison of Pam and Katrina. I'm going to walk through this rather quickly, and you'll see that by and large the predictions were on track. Unwatering is a Corps of Engineers term, in case you think I made a mistake. Okay, so we have the technology, we had the technology to be able to predict within the confines of what we understood storms to do. We worked with the National Hurricane Center. We did the projection based on an actual hurricane that had occurred, Hurricane George, which was almost the storm that was Katrina. But the track shifted, and it wasn't the catastrophic storm that was expected, so we shifted the track back to affect New Orleans and put a lot more rainfall into the model of a Category 3 storm, and then projected the consequences from there. But this kind of modeling is no longer as effective as it used to be, because we don't know, we can't predict the Harveys as well. We can't predict the Great Flood of Louisiana in 2016 as well. We're not able to predict the way that the storms are intensifying fast and close to the coast. There's a lot more rainfall coming with these storms. They are hovering and staying on the coastline for much longer periods of time, dumping enormous amounts of rain and causing intense amounts of damages. So this technology will have to be considered as we move forward to try to reduce the cost of natural disaster. The second thing is demographics. Craig Fugate, who was the director of administrator of FEMA, used to say that there are no natural disasters. There are disasters that occur because human beings tend to put themselves in harm's way. And so there's nothing natural about them in that sense. The natural part of it is the events occur, and so the events are occurring already and at greater frequency. So where are the demographics? And demographic, there's a destiny to demographics. You can predict it much more quickly and accurately. So what is going on with that? 80% of the world's population lives within a few miles of the coastline. And so all of these natural disasters that we're talking about, the Pacific Ring of Fire for earthquakes, hurricanes and typhoons, flooding events, a lot of them are concentrated in coastal areas, and that's where the world's population lives. 2 billion people live in mega cities that are coastal cities around the world, like New York and Miami and other cities. And the other thing that is not well understood outside of emergency management is that the population that is the most vulnerable is the elderly population. When you look at the tsunami that occurred in Japan, the vast majority of the people who died were over 65 and even over 75, because the elderly are the most unwilling to move or unable to move and evacuate from the areas that are at risk when a storm is coming in. So children are another category of people in Hurricane Katrina. In Louisiana, 5,500 children were separated from their caregivers or guardians or parents, and they had to be reconciled back to their families again. And so this is another major factor that we need to think about. This is a study that was done by one of the newspapers that looked at the deaths in Katrina. And I know we're talking about disaster costs, generally funding levels, but one of the biggest costs, the ultimate cost, is the cost of lives. And so looking at all of the deaths that occurred in New Orleans from Katrina, it affected every socioeconomic strata of society roughly in the same proportion that it was there in that community. So where you had a concentration of African American people, deaths occurred in that population. Where you had a concentration of middle-class people, deaths occurred there. What was disproportionate about it was the role of the elderly. The elderly died disproportionately in Hurricane Katrina and in other disasters that we see. And because of that, and the knowledge of that, when I first started getting involved in this in 1985, I developed a scale that looked at the depth of inundation versus the probability of death. Now, you might say it's morbid, but you need this kind of technology, you need this kind of heuristics to be able to figure out the value of evacuation prior to the event that says how many people are left there and how many people would potentially be killed if we don't take the right actions. So which brings me to really the central point of what I'm going to talk about, which is what is it, how do we protect ourselves in the places that we live, work, and play? And when we look at that, most disaster funds go to three specific areas: infrastructure, housing, and economic development. And each one of them offers us an opportunity to do something better, and each of them offers a unique challenge also. So this is a picture before and after of the night lights in Puerto Rico before Hurricane Maria and after Hurricane Maria. And the thing that we see over and over again is that the largest costs that are there from a disaster are to the infrastructure. It's estimated right now that Puerto Rico might receive something on the order of $90 billion of disaster funding from the federal government. Over 70% of that is going to go towards infrastructure. And in New York, after Hurricane Sandy, more than $15 billion of money went to infrastructure. After Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and Mississippi, very high amounts of money went to infrastructure. And if you count the amount of money that went to recreate the levees in New Orleans, that approaches a $100, $200 billion mark in terms of infrastructure spending. So infrastructure, particularly the lifeline infrastructure, power, water, wastewater, healthcare, those infrastructure components are really affected tremendously in disasters, and they are also the ones that receive the maximum amount of funding. But one of the things that I tend to think about is that disasters are like putting water in a sieve. They find the weaknesses in the communities and exploit them. So our infrastructure is very weak at this time in this country. Because of the history of the United States, it's been 200 plus years. A lot of the infrastructure was built in the 1950s, let's say, for the interstate system. Other infrastructure is much older. Our dams and bridges and roads, healthcare facilities, airports, they are all showing the signs of age. This is the scorecard from the American Society of Civil Engineers in 2017. They give it an overall grade of D, and you see that post-disaster, you see the spectacular results of having an infrastructure that's crumbling in the various places. Let's take Puerto Rico, for example. More than $26 billion is expected to go into the power grid alone. Why? Because 70% of the power generation capacity of Puerto Rico is in the south part of the island, whereas 70% of the demand is in the north side of the island. And they have strung all of that transmission distribution from the south to the north through mountains, and it's very fragile and really vulnerable. And we saw that in Maria. Aside from the deferred maintenance and aside from the fact that the power company, Puerto Rico PREPA, has been basically in bankruptcy with the amount of debt that they have. So looking at that, the core programs that fund infrastructure are the FEMA Public Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Both of them are controlled by the Stafford Act. And the Public Assistance Program, which is the primary funder of infrastructure repair, had a requirement that you could only build back the way it was before. Makes no sense, because the needs of the community today are very different from the needs of the community when that infrastructure was first developed. And so starting with Katrina, FEMA started to work with states and counties and cities to try to innovate within the confines of the Stafford Act. And some initial things were done. For example, the school system in New Orleans. There were a lot of schools. The school system was failing. It was not producing the educational outcomes that we needed. And FEMA and the state worked together to create the Recovery School District. Whether you believe it's the right or wrong thing to do, created a system of charter schools, reconfigured where the schools would be located based on the population that was there after Katrina, and where the population was expected to grow after Katrina. Because again, you have to forecast the demographics and say, where is it that this school really needs to be effective? This resulted after Hurricane Sandy. This was accelerated, and FEMA developed what is now popularly called the 428 program. And that allows flexibility so that you have a bucket of money available that says, okay, for this water system or this wastewater system that was damaged, we're going to give you, I'll give you an example of it, close to $500 million for Suffolk County or $900 million for Nassau County in New York. And you can have some flexibility in what you design so that it meets your future needs and it's more resilient and it's more affordable to maintain going forward in the future. So these ways of infrastructure spending have been very helpful. And of course, primary amongst the programs is also the CDBG DR program from HUD, but it's not a standing program yet. And so after every disaster, we have a scramble to get supplemental appropriations to be able to provide funding for those programs. There is a lot of innovation going on in the infrastructure arena. I'll mention several of them. And that's great because we really need a lot of innovation in spending for infrastructure. For example, we have funded all the infrastructure, the public infrastructure in this country through tax dollars in one way or the other, state, local, federal tax dollars. Is that the right model to have going forward? And there's experimentation going on right now on public-private partnerships, P3s. Puerto Rico had created a P3 office even prior to Hurricane Maria. They are experimenting, thinking through the idea of actually using a P3 model for the power transmission distribution system in Puerto Rico. So this way of funding infrastructure development is new to the United States. It's a concept that's been used elsewhere in South America, Europe, and Asia, but it's a concept that's coming to the United States, and we're seeing a lot of that happening. And that spreads the costs out from the public sector and starts to put the burden onto the private sector. Second thing that's going on is that for the first time, and this has been accelerated since 2016, communities are actually raising money themselves. They're saying, we are going to invest in mitigation ourselves. Harris County, after Hurricane Harvey, raised $2.5 billion in a bond offering. And the city of Miami has Miami Forever, which is $100 million for looking at how to make the city more resilient from the flooding that they have continuously. And also places like North Carolina are looking at how to be able to deal with road improvements and road building. So just a little segue here. Roads are maintained and paid for through the gas tax. So what's happening is as more and more people use electric vehicles, the gas tax collection is going down. And then if we go to automated vehicles and we start using them like electric scooters, where we just use them and abandon them and we don't own them anymore, then what happens? How does the government have enough money to be able to pay for the road maintenance and the road building programs? So people are struggling with all of these things. How do we do this better? Louisiana has a coastal master plan that they've developed. It's $50 billion over 50 years to be able to look at coastal restoration. How do you fund something of that magnitude? Currently, it's funded by the petroleum offshore. And then on that additional note, I want to also mention sustainability. Michelle talked this morning about life cycle costs, and certainly we should look at life cycle costs. For example, in Puerto Rico right now, they are going to demolish 17,000 structures at a minimum, maybe as much as 25,000 structures. Most of them are made of concrete. What happens to all that concrete when we demolish these, and do we send it to a landfill? Where is there a landfill in Puerto Rico that can accommodate this volume of debris? Each disaster is resulting in massive amounts of debris. And so in New York, Governor Cuomo has come up with a plan for the old Tappan Zee Bridge, which is a 60-plus-year-old structure, is going to be destroyed. And the concrete from that will be harvested, 40,000 cubic yards of it, and put offshore of Long Island in the coastal waters to be able to create coral over there. And it's an experiment to see if you can actually use concrete. It may be surprising to find out that actually there are some countries that are recycling about 95% of their construction and demolition waste. We are doing about 5%, so we have a great ability to be able to reduce the life cycle costs of infrastructure by reusing and recycling the materials that we have already used. So let's talk about housing. Housing is generally the second most expensive part of disaster recovery. But, and I think Governor Barbour would agree with this, housing is number one in terms of politics. If a CEO, whether it's a mayor or a governor, does not get a handle on housing recovery, that is a huge problem. People expect infrastructure to take longer. They have a tolerance for delays in systems coming online later, but housing is one that is at the center of the emotional nerves of disaster recovery. And what's happening more and more now, it was happening before to a lesser extent, is this idea that says, let's not just build back where we had people before. Does it make sense to build back here? There are communities like, there's one community in Louisiana called Ile-de-Jean. It's a tribal community. They are in an area where they are flooding very consistently. And the issue was, should we do something about moving this community? So there's a program now to try to get the community to move out of this vulnerable area and go to a place where they are less unsafe. However, the livelihood and the culture of that community is based on being water-based. They are a water-based community. That's what their history is, that's what their culture is, that's where their economics are. How do you take people from that environment and put them, let's say, in a cornfield and say, okay, now you're safer here, but you can't sustain that community there. Similarly, Princeville, North Carolina is a very old African-American community and has had tremendous problems with flooding. And there's a desire to move the entire community and put them in a safer location out of the floodplain. Similar issues there of how do we make this happen? How do we gain the trust of people? How do we help them make the cultural transition to some other place? The other thing with housing is that, frankly, housing recovery takes too long. I mean, if you've had the experience of having the power out in your home, and it's an extended outage for several hours, that's frustrating. Imagine not being able to go home for 12 years. That's how long it took the last few victims of Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana to get home through the Road Home program. It literally ended just recently. And so housing recovery is taking a very long time. The Hurricane Sandy victims, not all of them are home today, almost 7 years later. And so we really have to figure out not just the cost of these programs, but how to speed these programs. And here's an interesting dichotomy. If you get the people home faster, it costs less than if you take longer, because it's a very labor-intensive process, the way we do disaster recovery for housing. And so if you can get people into their homes faster, the programs cost less. And it's a win-win for everyone, because it's a win for the government for sure, it's a win for the homeowner, it's a win for the contractors that are supporting this effort. I think that we really need to experiment on the use of data and science on how to make housing recovery go better and faster for the people that are involved. And on that note, I will mention to you that I've had the pleasure of working for Jamie Rubin in New York on the housing recovery program there. He's on the first panel, and that was our first attempt to really push the envelope and use what we call accountable pricing, where we don't get paid as a contractor unless we move the homeowner forward. And that notion, which the state of New York accepted as an innovative idea, has now taken hold in this whole field. And pretty much everyone is doing housing recovery based on accountable pricing. And so innovations can come not just from innovative ideas of what to do, but also how to do them. And I think that's a key in doing what we do today. After the great floods of 2016 in Louisiana, when we started working with the citizens in Louisiana, and that program is going to serve about 25,000 or so people, 25,000 families, essentially. We really pushed hard to see how far we could push that envelope. And we're able to get awards to all of the homeowners within a year of starting. Sounds like a very long time. It is. It's an enormously long time. However, it was by far the fastest program in US history. And so we need to figure out some more how we use data and analytics and science to move it even faster. One of my big bugaboos is damage assessments. Every agency does damage assessments. FEMA does damage assessments, SBA does damage assessments, CDBG-DR comes in and does damage assessments also. So economic development is the last area, and what I will tell you is that wherever there's major infrastructure, major cities, there's huge costs because infrastructure is expensive. Think of New York City. But then when the disaster affects a rural area, a rural community, which is already struggling economically, they have a real problem. And small businesses in that community have a real problem. So if a small business faces a disaster, if they're shut down for 2 weeks, they have a 50% chance of reopening. And so disasters result in about 40% of the small businesses in that community shutting down forever. And 100,000 homes, small businesses were affected negatively economically even 5 or 7 years after Hurricane Katrina. So this is an area where we don't have good programs. We don't have simple programs. We haven't thought through what we can do. Can we use opportunity zones? Can we use tax incentive financing? What can we do to help the economies of the areas? And I'll give you an example of this, and this is the last thing I will mention, is that when the New Madrid earthquake occurred in New Madrid, Missouri, in 1811, it was trying to vie with St. Louis to be the regional hub. And this massive earthquake occurred, which caused the Mississippi River to flow backwards, and the church bells rang out in Virginia. I mean, it was a massive, massive earthquake. It took New Madrid 65 years to get back to the population it was the day before that earthquake struck. And it never retained its ground in the pantheon of cities. We don't know where New Madrid is today. Everybody knows where St. Louis is today. So that's the effect of disasters on communities and on the economic strata. So I hope that this gives you some food for thought and questions for the panels that are coming. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for those wonderful remarks. I'm going to turn now to our second panel, and I'm going to introduce the moderator who will introduce the panel. Pam Patnow is a longtime friend of BPC and former employee. She ran our housing project here at BPC. She did do a stint over at the Housing and Urban Development as assistant secretary and was really the lead on the Puerto Rico recovery efforts in the immediate aftermath of the hurricanes last year. And so it's a great panel. We have Pam, who's obviously great experience in Puerto Rico, Governor Barbour, who was obviously governor of Mississippi when Katrina hit, and Jamie Rubin, who was New York's lead for Hurricane Sandy recovery. So please let me introduce Pam and have her come up to the panel.
Thank you, Michelle. Governor Barbour, it's great to see you again today.
Good to see you, Pam.
Jamie, it's so nice to meet you. I had the pleasure of working with Governor Barbour after Hurricane Katrina some 14 years ago. We just approached past, I guess, the 14th anniversary since Katrina. And Jamie and I are just meeting for the first time, but I said to Jamie when I went back to HUD as the deputy secretary, Hurricane Harvey had just happened a couple weeks before. Irma had happened just a few days before. I arrived at HUD, and 2 days later, Hurricane Maria hit. So I do think there is something to do with Pam and hurricanes. And I said, if I had only known, I'm not sure I would have gone back to HUD as the deputy secretary, because I had to chair the disaster management group. As the assistant secretary of community planning and development, I focused on CDBG-DR, and I can say without a doubt that Governor Barbour continues to be the poster child of how a strong leader, an exceptional leader, can can really make a difference in a disaster. And it's there were 2 states that were heavily impacted back by Katrina, and then I call it the wicked stepsisters of Rita and Wilma that followed shortly after. But what I really would like to do this morning is to focus on some of the successes that Governor Barbour had in Mississippi. Louisiana struggled tremendously, and here Governor Barbour, and he did cross the border often to try to help his colleagues in Louisiana, but we rarely talk about the success of the programs, and we don't document the best practices. So when governors asked me when I returned to HUD, who can I talk to? We said Governor Barbour, and he did talk to many of the governors after Maria. So if we could just take a minute and have you talk about, quickly touch on housing and infrastructure and economic development, because you really had some tremendous success in all 3 areas.
Pam, thank you. First of all, I think you need to understand that the federal disaster law, the Stafford Act, does not contemplate the mega disaster. It doesn't contemplate Katrina, which comes in and obliterates Mississippi's Gulf Coast and with hurricane force winds 140 miles inland. And then in Louisiana, they had Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, says 1 storm, 2 disasters, because their disaster was very different from ours. They didn't have wind damage that left, we created, Pam, a new verb, slabbed. I've been slabbed. There's nothing left of my house but a slab. And we had about 25,000 of those in the 3 counties on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. In Louisiana, the levees broke, and it was flooding that was everywhere. Very different disaster, but a terrible, terrible disaster. So, but the Stafford Act did not contemplate that. There was no program for permanent housing. We lost 60,000 units of housing on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And inland, we had another 40,000 houses that were uninhabitable, some of them 100 miles inland. And there was no program under federal law for permanent housing. And God bless Pam and the Bush administration and Congress that they allowed us to have what we call a homeowners assistance program. Louisiana had something similar as we went along. But if you were in the floodplain and you had flood insurance, of course you had coverage. If you were in the floodplain and didn't have coverage, the government really didn't give you much help. But we had thousands of homes, as Madhu mentioned, that were outside the floodplain that were totally destroyed by the storm surge, which is not covered by homeowners insurance because in insurance law, it's a flood. Yet the floodplain maps had been done last on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in 1981. And this is 2005, 24 years later. So the floodplain maps were so incredibly out of date that we had more houses destroyed by the storm surge outside the floodplain than inside the floodplain. Just because there had been that much growth, Madhu will tell you, or Jamie can tell you, it's not just new houses get built or new areas, it's old areas become flood likely because there's some change in the landscape 2 miles away. That they build a shopping center and all of a sudden all the water runs off the pavement in a great fast speed. The Stafford Act doesn't contemplate that. The Stafford Act also doesn't provide for workforce labor housing. As I mentioned, we had 60,000 houses in the 3 coast counties that were uninhabitable. In 5 years, we built back 58,000 of them. In 3 counties where prior to Katrina, the most houses ever built in the 3 counties combined in a year was 1,800. Well, who was it? For candidly, it was a very, very large group of Spanish speakers, some citizens and some not, I'm sure, who came in from the West, and they got to Louisiana, and a lot of them kept right on going because things were happening faster in Mississippi, and they came looking for work. And they slept in the beds of pickup trucks. They slept in tents. It was unbelievable. But the federal disaster law takes no account that if you have the mega disaster, you're going to have places for the people who are building your communities back to stay. You have, and so what would happen is, I'm sure Madhu and Jamie both can see, you have temporary housing for the people who are displaced. And we call them trailers. They're not trailers. They're campers. They're tiny, tiny little deals. And we had people that lived in them for 3 years, that lived in a camper with children. I remember my wife, Marcia, the congressional delegation came down, and Denny Hastert was Speaker of the House at the time, and Denny's shaped a little bit like me. And Marcia made him go into a FEMA trailer, a camper, so that he could prove to himself a grown man could not close the door in the bathroom while he was standing in it. I mean, it was just unbelievable how the conditions these people lived in. But I mean, here's what you learned. If you're going to build your communities back, and if people are going to come back, they got to have a place to stay. They got to have a job. And their kids got to have a place to go to school. They won't come back with the intention of staying for the long term unless they believe their communities are going to come back at least as good, if not better, than they were before. And those are the first three things that get them there. And then things have to happen in terms of economic development. You know, I can remember the very first manufacturing industry on the Gulf Coast to reopen was a vacuum cleaner manufacturing company, Oric. And Oric himself came down, and we had a big deal. This was like within 2 or 3 weeks of the storm. And we had a big deal. They hired everybody back that was there, and they brought in people. And that just gave people confidence that the place was coming back. And Huntington Ingalls Shipyard, which has 9,000 employees, I mean, they went out and they got housing for their employees to get them to come back. But that's what this is all about at the end of the day, Pam. Are you gonna get your people to come home? Is it gonna be a place like the Mississippi Gulf Coast is today? If you're not familiar with the coast, you come back down there, and with very few exceptions, you can't tell that there was the worst natural disaster in American history hit there, because it's all been built back. It's all been built back to a higher standard, with actually one major exception. The coast is snaggle-toothed. And I say snaggle-toothed because you go along and you'll see lots on the beach that no house has been built back on. And the reason is the government rightly, I didn't like it, but rightly says you got to build back consistent with the flood maps. So in a lot of these places, the house has got to be 20 feet off the ground. Well, some old goat my age ain't going to build a house. You got to walk up 20 feet worth of steps, and unless you're rich enough to have an elevator, and there are some of those, but those are the kind of things that are the exceptions on the Mississippi Gulf Coast today. And a lot of it was because of innovation. CDBG, we got about $4.5 billion of CDBG money, which had never been used in a natural disaster before. And how did we come to CDBG? We had two things. A program that existed so that the federal government wouldn't have to start from scratch making rules. So a program that existed, and they were running it at HUD. And secondly, in my opinion, a program that the governor controlled and the legislature didn't have any chance to get their hands on the money, so that we could plan with the federal government here's what we're going to do, here's our plan. They approved it before Congress passed it in general, but it took 4 months. When you start from scratch and you're making it up as you go along, and we were, and we did a lot of things wrong, and I will tell you about leadership. I wrote a book about this called America's Great Storm, and one of the points I make in it, you're going to make some bad decisions. You know, you show me somebody in the mega disaster who doesn't make bad decisions, I'll show you somebody who doesn't make decisions. Because you're going to make some bad decisions, but I'm going to tell you, in the mega disaster, a bad decision is almost always better than no decision. Because nature taking its course in the mega disaster is a bad outcome. So you got to be willing to make decisions, and then you got to be willing when your staff and others say, hey boss, this ain't working like we thought. You got to be willing to step up and say, we're going to change it. Here's why. And HUD was great with us about letting us work with them and do this. But I will say, and I think it's important, because we were making it up as we went along, storm was August 29th. It was late December before the first emergency supplemental disaster assistance bill was passed. In between, we just made do on regular Stafford Act stuff. It's some of which is great, but their idea was, okay, all the people who lost their houses, they can stay in the motel. Well, hell, there weren't any motels. I mean, the motels were blown to smithereens with very few exceptions. Even the nicest hotels on the coast were blasted. So we had to just make do. And I can tell you, Superstorm Sandy presented these guys with many of the same things. That a lot of the time you're going to be making it up as you go along, and you got to have, unless the government changed the Stafford Act, which they should have done 15 years ago, by the way. But unless they do, just get ready for making it up as you go along part of the time.
Thank you, Governor Barbour. I'll have to remember that term, slabbed. I can remember touring and that my neck hurt because we couldn't take our eyes off of it. I'd never seen anything like it, and I had brought a group of interns that were working with us at the time in CPD, and they said that was life-changing to see what a hurricane could do to these properties. I think even Senator Lott lost his home.
He did. Senator Lott's house was at elevation 19, 80 miles to the east of the eye of the storm. Found nothing but an ashtray. Just total obliteration.
I'd like to go back to the timing on the funding, but I want to turn to Jamie first. Jamie, we're about to approach the 7th anniversary. I remember I was working here running the Housing Commission and watching the weather forecasts about Hurricane Sandy. And although I was not in the government, I had 2 kids that were in college at Fairfield University, and one was a senior and said she wanted to live on the beach. Well, that didn't last long because the beach houses were wiped out on the Long Island Sound. So, Jamie, can you talk about the success that New York had under then and now? He's still the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, who, by the way, had been the Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development. And they actually had used CDBG DR back in the late 90s when he was either the Assistant Secretary or the Secretary of HUD, but it was very small compared to the nearly $5 billion that you secured for Mississippi. So, Jamie, if you could just talk about the success as the czar in New York, the disaster czar.
I'm going to keep it very, very short because I want to make sure you've got time to get to other things. We did a number of things I think well, and then plenty of things badly, and got no credit for the things we did well, and plenty of blame for the things we did badly, which is the world that we live in. So, we did one thing we did very well, which is we hired Madhu Barrawal at IEM. They were the second major contractor that we hired to run our housing program. The first one was an utter failure, frankly, and was hired by my predecessor, who lost his job largely as a result of it, and did poorly and cost way more than IEM did. IEM came in with performance, and this is not an advertisement for IEM, but performance and innovation and cost effectiveness, and so that was a sea, no pun intended, sea change in our housing program. We did a few things I think well. We got and we had a little test bed for that in New York State because we had about $10 billion of CDBG-DR. I'm going to skip the Stafford Act because the governor covered it, but CDBG-DR, we got about $10 billion appropriated in New York State. And there were basically 2 equal-sized damage centers in New York State from Hurricane Sandy, Long Island and New York City. That's where the storm hit. And they were about the same amount of damage and actually similar housing stock that was damaged, notwithstanding the fact that New York City obviously has multifamily. The places that the storm hit was on the coast, which is Staten Island and then East Brooklyn, and that was basically single-family housing. So, and then Long Island was basically single-family housing as well. So very, very similar demographics. The whole thing was the same. And I'll just be blunt with you because this has been widely recorded and reported on. New York State, we got 2 separate allocations. New York State got about $5 billion appropriation. New York City got a $5 billion appropriation. A little unusual that they set it separately to New York City, but that was the way they did it. New York City ran theirs, we ran ours. The governor's exactly right that works far better than going through the legislature or whatever. Unfortunately for New York City, which is not where I worked, they decided to take the money, send it through their budget, you're already groaning, send it through their budget office, which is OMB, like in Washington, which had the first level and last level of control over how things got spent. And then they distributed basically responsibility for spending the money throughout the rest of the city agencies. Again, so very distributed model. And OMB was the last line of defense. And then Mayor Bloomberg, it also fell in transition. Mayor Bloomberg was there for a little while, then it was Mayor de Blasio. That didn't help. New York State did exactly the opposite. Anybody who's ever met Governor Cuomo can probably guess how he decided to do it. It all went through Governor Cuomo. So, and he hired me, which is fine with me. So I set up the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery with the mandate to spend the CDBG-DR money, $5 billion. We also had some responsibility for the other money we got, but this was what we're talking about now. I hired about 200 people in about 4 months. Which you cannot do in state government, and we did it. A lot mostly from the private sector. We set up a whole office downtown. The Department of Budget had exactly 0 control over the money because it wasn't state money. It was federal money that went right to the state. And then you could watch how these 2 programs rolled out. New York City, New York State, same amount of housing, 20,000 severely damaged single-family homes in Staten Island and East Brooklyn, 20,000 in Long Island. And I will leave it to you to Google the reporting on how the 2 programs compared. But we were, I think, by all accounts, a success in part because of IEM. And New York City has been an utter and complete failure. And you can tell because we ended up serving, I think it was about 20,000 homeowners. And New York City served about 7,000 to 8,000 homeowners. They've now spent all their money. We've spent all our money. And the reason New York City served 8,000 is because, A, they spent way too much on each home, up to $1 million a home, before they got control of it, and they took so long to serve people that they got sick of it and left the program. That's what happened. Whereas we took way too long, but we actually did serve people, and I'll skip the innovations as to how that happened, but that's what happened. So I would say we made some very, I think, good decisions, which is how we ran the thing. It was very centralized, very top-down, no nonsense. We skipped the whole budget thing because why would you send federal money through the state budget office? It made no sense. And we didn't give it out to the other agencies. We said we'll set up our own agency, thanks, and skip all the built-in state bureaucracy in a state where you've got 85,000 state employees. We had 200 and we did far better. So, and then the last thing we did is we had the ability to seek help from the private sector. And I think that made all the difference in the world. And there are people who will tell you that you spend too much on consultants, which, sometimes is the case, but if you spend the money well, it is ultimately economically efficient.
Jamie, that was excellent. I just want to comment on the timing, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. But when I arrived at HUD in September of 2017, Congress had actually already passed a supplemental in record time. But even though they had appropriated $7.4 billion, and only Harvey had occurred at that point. Then Irma happened. I think it was forecasted. And then Maria. It took until November to actually make the first allocation to Texas. But it takes the better part of a year before you even see the first drawdown. So it still is taking much too long. Let me open it up for questions because I think they want to hear more from you. And is there anyone that has a question for Governor Barbour or for Jamie Rubin?
Somebody's got his hand up.
Yeah, certainly. In regards to the thank you. In regards to the current reforming CWGDR companion legislation in the House and the Senate, what do you see in terms of either unintended consequences or not going far enough that needs to be proposed in that to really make CWGDR more effective, particularly in regards to the needs of low and moderate income persons?
I'll take one quick whack at it, and I gotta be, full disclosure. I'm not a creature of Washington anymore. I did a little bit of time, but that's not really my thing. So I'm back in the private sector. So I watched some of this stuff from a distance, and I have friends who are still involved. So I'm not real close to it. I will tell you, I think a couple of things. A close friend of mine who is now one of the leading advocates for reform of this area has made, I think, a great case that there should be permanent appropriation for, or at least permanent authorization for CDBGR, which I think is absolutely critical. Otherwise you wait. Let's just wait. Until people just can't come back. To the governor's point. Low and moderate income. I don't know which reforms they're thinking about. We had a sort of an unusual situation and very different, I suspect, from what happened in Mississippi, which is that Long Island was the principal place that we had to deal with, and that wasn't the demographic. It wasn't largely low, middle, and moderate income. The law says, I think, 70% has to be have 70% of the expenditure has to serve low, moderate income, and HUD wisely recognized that for Long Island that just didn't make any sense. And so reformed it in the rules that were written, and we got to 50%, and then frankly we didn't even hit that. It literally wasn't possible, and HUD was flexible in working with us. So I think that's a problem. It's about flexibility. I think if if we had a different demographic, of course we should have served more, and we found lots of creative ways to, with the businesses that we hired and so forth. But it's flexibility, I think, is important.
Yeah, I haven't been involved. I've been out of government for 8 years, so I haven't been involved in the reform efforts. But clearly, it's more than just reforming CDBG. I mean, the whole Stafford Act needs to be reformed. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. One of the first things that we wanted to do was build a statewide, interoperable, survivable communication system, digital. And FEMA would not approve that as a way to mitigate risk. There's a program where 7.5% of the money that you get under FEMA, you're allowed to spend on hazard mitigation. They would not approve an interoperable communication system where we could speak with Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, the Coast Guard, the Navy, every. What would be more important if you're trying to mitigate risk than if you're able to communicate with everybody? Heck, in Katrina, I might as well have been a Civil War general. I mean, I had to send somebody to Pascagoula, except on a horse, he'd be on a helicopter. But I mean, all the communication systems were obliterated, and some of the towers weren't built back for days. Senator Cochran, to his credit, took $210 million in FEMA's budget and took it out of hazard mitigation and put it somewhere else and says, okay, will y'all spend it on the interoperable communication system now? Because if you don't, I'm going to put it somewhere else. And to their credit, FEMA did, and we built the system out. But the flexibility and the ability to work together and between these programs. I mean, I think it's got to be a lot more than just the CDBG program being reformed.
I would agree with that. I mean, I had, sorry, give me this 1 second. I 100% agree with that. We actually found that FEMA and HUD working together was the best.
Within the government.
Anything having to do with SBA was far more difficult, and I'll spare you the anecdotes. And then I'm sure you've enjoyed working with the Army Corps over the years. That was entertaining. I did not.
They're good on the river.
Oh, they're fantastic.
But you don't need them in the Gulf.
No, well, I mean, the work they do, they're obviously highly, they're really a very professional group and all that kind of stuff. But understanding how they work, I finally sat down after my 8th meeting with these people. I finally said, look, somebody needs to come in and explain to me how the Army Corps. Just tell me how it's set up. And that was when I figured out there's 2 Army Corps, and then I went to a different job, so that was the end of that.
I just read an article earlier this week. Brock Long, the former FEMA administrator, said there are 90 federal programs that are related to disaster recovery spread over 18 federal agencies.
I'm sure.
So I would just echo that the reform efforts have got to be, you have short-term recovery that FEMA is responsible for, long-term recovery at HUD, and then the duplication of benefits with SBA. They have to take a holistic view, but I am encouraged that Congress is actually serious about reform right now.
And let me say one other thing. The news media, at least, has no concept of what FEMA is. Yeah. FEMA is not some giant army of people that goes out and does construction and builds back. And FEMA is a planning, training, cash register. And we worked with them we had Camille in 1969, which was a 200-mile-an-hour winds hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We thought it was the worst natural disaster we could ever have. And in fact, for 25 years, we trained for Camille. Unfortunately, we had Katrina, which was not at all like Camille. But they helped us train, and we're training down to the county level, 82 counties. And we had a unified command with when Katrina was 6 or 8 days out before we knew whether it was going to hit us or not. We put into effect our unified command with a command post with FEMA sitting across the table from Mississippi Emergency Management, but there wasn't ever any question. The state was in charge, and FEMA accepted that. But a lot of people think they are supposed to do all this. They get blamed for a lot of stuff. It's really not their job. That's the state's job. That's the locals' job. And I just think they deserve for that to be said.
Just have a couple minutes. Any other questions for Governor Barbour or Jamie Rubin? And back over here.
Thank you. This is kind of a question, two-part question about implementation, because we can do all the great policies, but then, getting it implemented, and that speaks to what the governor just said as well. But after Katrina, FEMA had a grant program. They issued grants to the Gulf Coast states to do an alternative housing pilot program for the disaster housing. And there were some very innovative, I thought, creative, sustainable solutions like the Mississippi Cottage that could also serve as permanent housing. They were, disaster resilient, they were energy efficient, they had good indoor air quality, they were attractive, But I think then there were zoning issues or something.
Some places there were.
But
yeah, the Katrina Cottages were an alternative to the FEMA trailers, the campers that came in. If I remember right, we built about 3,000 or 4,000 of them. And there are still a bunch of them you will see in communities, particularly on the coast. But I live 200 miles from the coast, and there are 4 or 5 Katrina Cottages, that's what we call them, Katrina Cottages, that are in my home county that people either live in, but they look like a trailer, but they 200 mile an hour, they'll withstand 200 mile an hour winds. You take them off the wheels, put them in the ground. They were great to let us do that, but we did have some communities that thought of them as trailers and said, we don't want to let them be inside the city limits.
Yeah, so, but you would consider that was
it was a great
program.
It was a great thing, and the cost over 10 years is about the same because of all the maintenance costs that you have to deal with for the little FEMA trailers.
So to give you just to the point of flexibility, though, Sandy, we had housing issues obviously, And because people remembered what had happened in Katrina, there was a big outcry. We need to get mobile homes. Let's get trailers. Let's get mobile homes in here. That's the way to solve this for at least the short term, because there wasn't really much of a sort of an emergency short-term housing program that worked through Stafford Act. Well, it turns out, first of all, there were some issues with formaldehyde in the trailer home, things like that. So it wasn't clear that it was a safe thing to do. Second of all, there's a big difference, it turns out, between putting a trailer home in New York State or New York City and Long Island and putting one in the Gulf Coast. 6 miles, you take somebody who's living somewhere in New York City and move them 6 miles away into a trailer home and tell them they're going to be there for 9 months, that's like a 2-hour commute for somebody. I mean, literally. And their kids were going to school one place, now they're moving 2 hours away from somewhere else. That, there's no grocery, it's not workable. It just simply does not work. Second of all, our real estate costs are very, very high in New York State because land is fairly scarce in these densely populated areas. There isn't anywhere to put trailers for the most part, at least not in scale. It probably sounds like it's a bit different where you all are. So, but you take a place where it's $100,000 an acre. People aren't that excited about dropping a trailer down on that place for a long period of time. So it simply didn't work. So we basically had to wrestle our way through to some other solutions.
Very good point. I know the Mississippi Cottage could meet the manufactured HUD code, manufactured housing, as well as the local code. So it wasn't necessarily trailer, but then maybe some of them were. But that, to your point, Mr. Rubin, that was not going to work in New York. The other question, if I may, was about the Stafford Act. So we did see in 2018 the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that I think is a very positive step in the right direction in terms of providing more money for pre-disaster mitigation, 6% authorized to be set aside for that. But again, it's all about how it gets implemented. So I'd be curious if anyone had any comments on that. Thank you.
We are, we're the most generous people in the history of the world. And we found that out with Katrina, with the worst natural disaster in American history, resulted in the greatest outpouring of generosity and philanthropy in the history of the world. And by the way, I include time in that. We had 960,000 volunteers that came to Mississippi over 5 years. And time is the only thing you got that you can't get more of. And so when people are giving you their time, they're really being generous, is my point. But we are so incredibly generous after the fact and very unwilling to spend money on resilience and mitigation. And it's just, with the change in the world like artificial intelligence and the more information that we have about geology and seismology and topography and infrastructure, we can do so much more in advance of predicting what will happen and finding the worst and start there to make that more resilient. But boy, that's a hard sale. I know we're through, but I got to tell a little story. As you may imagine, Barney Frank and I are not great political pals. And so on the first day of November after the storm, I was in Washington. I went in the House side of the Capitol, and I hear a voice, Haley. I look over, it's Barney Frank. He and I had once been on a television show together. We didn't really know each other. He said, I heard Mississippi's got a plan for your Katrina recovery. And I said, yes, sir. I have just taken it to the White House, and I'm on my way to see the Speaker. Barney Frank, pretty liberal Democrat, we might say, and not exactly a normal ally of Mississippi. He said, if you'll give me a copy of the plan, I will send it to every Democrat member of the House and tell them I am voting for this, and I hope you will too. It's a reminder in politics, no such thing as a permanent enemy. You're lucky you got some permanent friends. But my point is, people, as far removed as they could be from Mississippi, knew their constituents wanted to help. So they wanted to help. and they knew that we on the ground had a better idea of what ought to be done than anybody in Washington. And that's another part of what sometimes people don't understand. People up here are really, really, really willing to help. But we've got to teach them that helping them beforehand is a whole lot more fiscally responsible than waiting till you have, Superstorm Sandy.
For sure.
Well, on that note, bipartisanship, how important it is. It's a pleasure to work with both of you, and thank you for the contributions that you both made to rebuilding your communities, and thank you for continuing to stay engaged in this dialogue. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy Winkler, who's going to introduce the next panel.
So that's a tough act to follow, and we're a little bit behind on time. So I want to quickly introduce Terry Dinan. She has for decades worked at the Congressional Budget Office, and over the last few years, her research has really focused on the costs to both the economy and to the federal budget of natural disasters and climate change. And then we have Jeremy Gregory, who is a research scientist at MIT. He is an expert in all things sustainable materials, hazard mitigation, and climate adaptation. And I really have three sort of overarching questions, which we can immediately jump into. One is essentially, what do we expect moving forward? Governor Barbour mentioned disaster mitigation. I think that's a good place to start. What are the costs that we expect into the future? What do we do about them, and who pays for them? So maybe, Terry, if you want to start and do some level setting on the estimates that you have done of disaster costs moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Sure. As Andy said, we've done a couple of studies in recent years kind of trying to get a handle on this issue. And before I tell you the actual costs that we estimate, I just want to explain a little bit about how to interpret the numbers that I'm going to tell you, because they can be a little confusing. So when we talk about our estimates of the cost to the economy and the cost to the federal budget, they're expected cost. And expected costs can be thought of as kind of a very long-run average cost if you could observe hundreds of years of potential storms under current conditions. So they're different than historical averages, they're different than a typical year, they're different than a catastrophic year. They really take into account all the potential storms that could occur, weighted by the probability that you'll have a storm like that. So most recently this spring, we released a paper that looked at the expected cost associated with hurricane winds, storm surges, hurricane-related precipitation, and inland precipitation. And we estimated the expected cost of those damages would be $54 billion. So that's an annual expected cost. That cost is both uncertain. There's lots of uncertainty surrounding these estimates, and it's also incomplete. That cost does not include, it includes expected cost to households, to commercial businesses, and to the public sector, but it does not include expected cost to industries such as damage to the oil industry that could occur, and it does not include kind of the emotional cost associated with losing a home and having your children have to go to a different school, et cetera. So that's what we estimated based on current conditions. We estimated that the federal budget cost in expectation, which includes an expected shortfall in the National Flood Insurance Program. It includes expected expenditures on federal disaster assistance through FEMA and through HUD and the Small Business Administration, was roughly $17 billion. A few years back, we looked at the expected cost associated with a subset of those, and that was just associated with hurricane winds and storm surges, which is all the modeling information we had at that time. And we looked at that in contrast with the current paper, that we looked at changes in time, changes in cost over time. And in that case, we estimated that measured as a share of GDP, those costs would likely grow by 40% between the present day and 2075, measured again as a share of GDP. And the reason for that growth was roughly half due to coastal development and half due to the influence of climate change.
Great. Do you want to step in and talk, as we have these expected costs, we're trying to, in any disaster, the federal government is going to step in. We want to help people, as Governor Barbour said. So how do we, adjust to fully pay for these things or minimize the cost both, in terms of money, but also in terms of lives? Sure. And you've done a lot of look at what we need to do to buildings, and CBO has looked a little bit at the options going forward of what the federal government can do. One of them, I think one of 5 items in that last paper you mentioned, is disaster mitigation. So how do we more fully pivot from just disaster relief to pre-disaster mitigation?
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction between recovery versus mitigation that happens in advance. And of course, we are an engineering institution, and so we do tend to look at sort of the technical side of this. But there are a lot of options for mitigation against disasters and various ways to do that. And what we do is, for each individual building, take a life cycle approach that has many overlaps with what Terry mentioned as well, where we look at how you design a particular structure and what you would expect in the future in terms of natural disasters. And then over that time, how much damage would you likely expect to get for that building, and how much would it cost to repair that? So when you take that life cycle perspective and look at initial construction and then damages due to hazards over time, what you can do is basically compare conventional construction with more hazard-resistant construction. And of course, the hazard-resistant construction usually will have some price premium to it, but then over time you'll have lower costs associated with damage due to hazards, right? So, we looked at some residential cases in New Orleans and found that you can get payback periods for more hazard-resistant construction of like 2 to 3 years, because I think it's people often associate really hazard-resistant construction with being very expensive, but really it's not that much more expensive, within 10% or so, but the savings that you get over time can be significant. Like we looked at one case of conventional construction in a place like New Orleans where over 50 years you would spend more on repairs to that building than you did on the initial construction price, right? And so it just, when you take that life cycle perspective, it makes complete sense. The challenge that we have is that incentives aren't aligned for the decisions around the people who are doing the design and construction with the people who end up paying for the repairs in the long run.
And so there's a lot of uncertainty built into both of the estimates that you have on your side. We don't know the exact path, the number of storms, where they're going to hit, who's going to flood. As Madhu said in her opening remarks, we don't have good flood maps in some places. Do we really have a grasp of the vulnerabilities that we have? And can we expect people to start to make, different decisions about where they live and how they build if they don't feel like it's going to happen to them? I don't know who wants to take that one.
Sure. I can. The more time I spend thinking about sustainability, the more I think it comes down to just behavior change. Like there's technical solutions for how we deal with hazard mitigation, but if we can get people to prioritize these things, that's where we'll start making changes. And I haven't been personally involved in this, but there is some interesting behavioral science research that's on this topic. And basically looking at, you have major challenges here, and that people really think in the short term. They're overly optimistic about the type of risks that they're going to see or not see. And they're not good at thinking long-term and making the appropriate investments. And so I think there are opportunities, though, to change the norms that we have associated with construction. Rather than viewing resilient construction as the alternative and a premium, we need to think of it as the norm. And basically, if you want to opt out of that and pay less, then you can. And we see other insights on this on behavioral science around, 401ks. Obviously, it used to be that you had to opt into a 401k, and then a lot of behavioral science research showed that actually let's change the default, and you get way more adoption and people saving when they see that. And so there's lots of ideas behind this, but I think we need to start to look at it from that lens as well. Take the technical side, but also how do we really gain insights on behavior change as well.
So Terry, you talked a little bit before about aligning incentives in this realm. So who could you get to pay? How do you move towards a system in which you really are aligning, the builder, the homeowner, if it's the flood insurance program, insurance companies, so that we are mitigating all of these things up front, and that the people who ultimately will pay for them are sort of pricing in the risk that they have?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I think part of the solution is having better understanding of the risks. We talk about a couple of different policy options that the Congress could consider in our most recent paper. One is spending more money on risk assessment so we can better understand what the risk actually is. As someone mentioned earlier, many of the people that were affected by Hurricane Harvey weren't in what was considered to be a floodplain, but those maps can be out of date. Another is figuring out better ways to communicate risk, which is something you just touched on. But for example, a 1% annual risk of incurring flood damage is equivalent to a 26% risk over the life of a 30-year mortgage. So trying to put risk in terms that people can better understand. And then also aligning incentives, for example, having flood insurance rates better reflect your actual risk, but also reflect the benefits that you get from mitigation. So giving them homeowners a financial incentive. And then with communities trying to do some of those same things, the National Flood Insurance Program currently has, in order for a community to be eligible, the members of their community be eligible for that insurance, they have to meet certain building code standards, but often those building code standards are not, don't reflect the most recent standards by the International Code
Council. Yeah.
Code Council. Yeah. So it gets at a little bit.
And so I think, Jeremy, actually you shared a New York Times article from just this week about what Canada has done. And they've started to take what some would perceive here, I think, as a more callous approach in incentivizing people to move and making hard decisions that, if your house flooded and the government, we paid 50% to rebuild this house, we're not going to do it again. So at your own risk. Yes. But we can't always, there is some callousness there, yes. But is that the line that we have to draw, that, the flood insurance program, whatever it is, we can't keep paying for these things? You, the homeowner, the community, have to accept that you've taken on this level of risk simply by living here?
Yeah, I think there's no question that I think particularly when it comes to flooding, we don't accurately represent the economic risk that people take in building in certain locations, right? And particularly when the government essentially is subsidizing the risks that people are taking. There's some extraordinary examples in this country where we have paid to rehabilitate or reconstruct buildings in floodplains multiple times that have vastly exceeded the original cost of the structure or of just moving people. And the example that you mentioned in Quebec that the New York Times and Christopher Flavel just reported on was basically like, we're not going to do that. We did it once, but we're not doing it again. And basically, you have to take on the economic risk. And some people chose to do that, and some people didn't. And I think that's fine. But that being explicit about what that risk is and how much it's worth to you, I think is really important. And if we don't make that explicit and kind of force some of those hard choices, then we're basically, as taxpayers, are subsidizing the lack of people willing to make those tough decisions.
And so what do we do about people who may not be able to afford to do that, or they are so tied to a community that they will never leave no matter what happens? we will always have the tendency to want to help people, and the federal government, like it or not, has had an increasingly important role in providing funding and providing assistance to communities affected. So what do we do about people that either cannot leave that community or don't have the funds to maybe think about, I'm buying this house, will it flood in, maybe I have a 1 in 3 shot that, it'll be hit by a hurricane in my lifetime. Those are really difficult questions for someone who's just trying to pay the bills. So what can the federal government do for those types of people?
I think we have a lot of dollars that we invest in hazard recovery. And basically what I'm saying is that rather than investing those purely in rebuilding, we can still help out those people. It's just that the default option shouldn't be rebuild it exactly how it was in the same place, right? We need to have more flexibility and investment in supporting those same people who need it most, just not to do it exactly the same.
Okay. We don't have a ton of time, so I want to get to audience questions and make sure you all have an opportunity to ask. Yeah, right here. There are 2 microphones around.
Sorry, first of all, regarding the hard-hearted, and you took on this risk, and the probability that when the flood or the disaster happens, we won't in fact step in is what? I mean, you really have to be willing to be hard-hearted all the way through, and we're not very good at that.
True.
The other thing about sort of buying on an incentive strikes me is what state and local governments do, with all due respect, Governor Barber, is they speed dial area code 202 when there's a disaster, right? So we don't have any way of aligning incentives with the states. But I want to make a more basic point about resilience is that it seems to me, be a mindset built into programs other than disaster programs. That is, if you're a highway grant, why isn't there a condition in the grant about resilience, even if it's not a mitigation grant? Why isn't there in a lot of things? And we can change the incentives in federal grant programs. So now I'm going to do a plug that I left out on the table, a lot of things on the GAO reports, and we will be coming out with a framework on sort of looking at how federal programs can encourage resilience and can work with state and locals. This is very consistent with a lot of what everybody here said.
Thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah, I think, just let me say one thing. I think one thing you hit on the head is that we look to hazard pre-disaster mitigation from an agency that has emergency in its name, right? And as you said, our expertise is in what happens afterwards, and so it's strange that we would look to them for guidance on how we design bridges and pavements and buildings to be more resilient. So I totally agree.
I just wanted to make 2 points on your comments. One of the points that we make in our paper is that we often spend the mitigation dollars post-disaster. So you're spending it where disaster already occurred, and typically it's kind of scattered, and we're not strategic about thinking about. So one of the things that we could think about is how we be more strategic getting ahead of it rather than responding, which is related to the points you've been making, Jeremy. But and then another thing I just wanted to mention is that even though we are generous after the fact, I think people forget that there's a lot of uncompensated cost to households. So one of the things we did is we compared how much compensation people would be expected to get for those who have covered by flood insurance and those who are not. And people who had flood insurance and expectation are going to get 85% compensation. Those who are not, it's like 20%. So I think people don't understand. Yeah, I think having a better understanding of what the hazards are, again, is important.
Right.
Yeah, certainly. I think a question for Terry. When you talked about the factors you utilized in your projection of cost over the coming 50 years, whatever the case may be, are there efforts to try to account for the extreme rain events that are well beyond, wind speed, well beyond storm surge that we're seeing in areas that likely never expected to flood? And I know it's hard without knowing a location to get an estimate, because they could be anywhere. But it also strikes me that's a huge vulnerability and cost driver as we look into the future. So how are efforts being made to account for that?
Well, those types of things are accounted for in these expected costs, in that we used a combination of different things to come up with our cost estimates, but we were relying on these catastrophic risk models, which are very large-scale models. They take a lot of computing capacity and a lot of data, but they're increasingly used in understanding risk because they can do exactly that. They can account for, they look at the whole spectrum of storms that might occur, including where they might hit, and they weight those by the probability of it occurring. So it includes these very catastrophic storms, low probability catastrophic storms, along with, much more frequent lower cost storms.
Nina in the back.
We've talked a lot about hurricanes and storms, so I just had a question of, do you consider wildfires to be a natural disaster, one? And then two, are there any good examples of communities or areas that have really taken a holistic, whole community approach to resilience? I think about, I have mosquito protection at my house, but my neighbors don't, so it's kind of a waste of my time and money to do it at my house if not everybody else is. So if there are any examples that we could learn from.
I would definitely consider wildfires to be a natural disaster, and I don't see as much community investment in preparing properly for wildfires. In fact, I think wildfires is one of those examples where we aren't appropriately capturing risk associated with where homes in particular are built. And for me, the symptom of that is that there are literally a big booming business in the West is essentially private firefighters for a home. There are services for supplementing firefighting around certain homes. And obviously, they're usually very expensive homes because that's a very expensive service. But it's insurance companies working with banks to provide this, because even investing in that is better than letting them burn down. So to me, that is definitely a sign that whatever insurance or prices, they're not adequately capturing the risk of building in those locations. And there are ways that you can construct buildings. And it's not just the buildings, it's also the site around the buildings to mitigate against the damages from those. And it's about the materials that you choose, and also but the brush that's around it. But I think one of the challenges is that wildfire is also one of those things where it's easy to say, we had a bad one here, but what's the probability of it happening again? And so those are some big challenges. It's an important point.
Jamie?
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jump in.
Actually, sorry, I lied. It's not a question.
You already have the mic.
That's true. Two things. One, to your this woman from GAO, I think. I'll make a plug for one thing. After Hurricane Sandy, the first thing I did was work on the Hurricane Sandy Task Force, which was set up by President Obama, run by Sean Donovan, and I ran a big chunk of it. And I would encourage you to go back and find that report, because that was all about federal intergovernmental cooperation, and it was a very, very geeky sort of list of I think it was 60 or 70 or 80 very specific recommendations, all having to do with intergovernmental cooperation, which I think made a lot of sense. It's kind of boring to read, but it probably was a predecessor to whatever GAO is, something like that. And then to your question about examples of community resilience, one thing we did, and we actually stole it from Katrina in Louisiana. New Orleans set up a program, sort of a predecessor of this. We set aside about $600 million of our CDBG-DR appropriation for something called Community Resilience, CRZ, it's been too long now, CRZ, whatever that was, Community Resilience. Thank you. Yes, there we go. And basically we picked the 100 most damaged areas from Sandy and also 2 predecessor storms all across the state. We just did some analysis and said these are the 100 most economically damaged places. And we allocated them each amount of money from $25 million down to $3 million, hired them at deeply discounted rates, some professional planners from all the big engineering firms, AECOM and Jacobs and all those places, gave them 6 months or something like that to work on with the communities with hyper-local to develop hyperlocal suggestions, plans that turned out to be, and you can still get them online, these very, very detailed, really well done resilience plans. And we said, we'll start to fund them for you, because there's no point, everybody has plans and they're never funded. So in the end, there were, I cannot remember how many actual interventions were recommended, but it was, well over 1,000 total. And many of them have actually now been implemented. And there were things like, everybody in this community that was damaged knows that it's this particular street that always floods. And AECOM came in and sent all their engineers and stuff and said, well, if you raise it, to this level or whatever it is, the modeling says it won't flood as much. And they did that. It's nothing like a comprehensive resilience plan, but it absolutely addressed repetitive damages that the community knew were there and had just never had the wherewithal to deal with. And that was, I think, something that was actually reasonably successful. And we did a ton of public engagement around it, so people sort of knew what was going on.
Yeah, I think that the community perspective is really important because, as you said, there are very famous pictures of Mexico Beach and this one house that withstood everything because they built it really resilient. But of course, everyone around it is demolished. There's only the slabs that are left on those ones, and I don't think many people want to live in that kind of community, right? So.
Any other questions?
Okay, I'm gonna stir up some trouble. So one thing I'm working on, I work at the National League of Cities. One thing I'm thinking about is climate migration and how that's going to have an impact on cities and counties. And in terms of, as it relates to this discussion, as you're thinking about, I'm just curious if this is even on anyone's radar. As we're thinking about long-term infrastructure costs and large-scale projects, is anyone kind of thinking about, we're in Orlando, we may see an incredible number of people move here in the next 20 years. If we're planning to build a new water treatment plant or, whatever, should we be including those demographic projections in these plans? And I think this is something that's happening. It's starting to trickle. I think we're just seeing the beginning of this right now. But I think it's just going to get really intense really quickly. So I'm wondering if this is on anyone's radar. Thanks, and great panel.
Either of you?
I haven't heard about it being on people's radar specifically in the context of sort of climate migration that you mentioned. But sort of as we heard, starting to incorporate resilience into infrastructure planning is definitely on people's radar. But I think one of the tricky things, people often ask me about sustainability versus resilience, and I often say that, sustainability is just we want things to last. But usually if we do a sustainability assessment, like what's the environmental impact of making this, we usually do it under sort of, typical or expected conditions. And I think of resilience as being those analyses for unexpected or atypical conditions. And that's what makes it hard, right? We can say we want this to be resilience, but as we heard, there's significant uncertainty about what's going to happen. And a lot of times we do these analyses and they're based on projections of storms or fires or whatever based on what's already happened. And as we heard earlier, those projections may not hold up. And so I think the great thing is that resilience is starting to be incorporated in terms of the demographic shifts. I can't comment as much on that, but the fact that it's starting to be discussed, and particularly, if government can do that, the big thing is we need it to shift to housing as well, because housing planning and development is disaggregated and is not as coordinated as much. And so codes can only help so much. I think we need to create more market demand for resilience in housing. There's on the first floor of this building, there's an Energy Star logo that's on this building. We need to get more logos for houses and buildings that say this is a resilient home. And there are some programs that do that, but we need more of that as well, so that when those people come and the development happens, that we make sure that they know this is a resilient structure. Right now, people aren't asking for that.
Any other questions? No? Well, please join me in thanking the panel. They've been great. And we'll linger around here if you have any questions. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.